Well, hello everyone. Thank you for swinging by today, especially with the sort of like room shuffle. The other half of the conference center apparently doesn't have power, and we'll see what happens. Anyway, this is just a little bit of an overview on the CNCF research user group, and we'll actually sort of do a little bit of like live polling because we want to see where you as researchers really want to see where the research user group goes and what features we want to drive. Let's see. Oh, and I did something dumb. I need to also introduce the other people involved. So the other co-chair here, Steve Quinnett, is right there. And our tech lead, Klaus Ma, unfortunately could not be here today. But he is pretty active within the community as well. So if you could, if you see that poll link down there, please pop it open. Let me activate this. Yep. We actually won't spend too much time on this. I'm going to go through, but we will take a look at this later. And the link at the top, pollev.com/BobKillen881, will be on every slide. Okay? Is it active? Oh, yeah, okay. So, why? Why are we actually here as research users? Why do we actually need a user group? To be honest, research needs are changing. With this crowd, I probably don't need to spend too much time on these points, but I kind of want to at least touch base on it anyway. We are seeing an increased use of containers, well, pretty much everywhere. We're seeing more complex workflows, and not just for the sort of research process itself, but with more enterprises and all sorts of groups sort of getting involved with more machine learning, things like model lifecycle are becoming more important. And sort of riding on that, we're also seeing more adoption of things like streaming data and eventing based on that data. And it's something that has been historically not really done that much in our field. We're also seeing much greater use of interactive science gateways, so things like Jupyter Hub. These days, that is sort of becoming the de facto standard, especially in the academic setting where everyone's getting notebooks. That's their first real experience with playing with this stuff. And backing those sort of science gateways, we see much greater demand on sort of persistent services supporting those things. Historically, you'd have something like your login node and your workload manager, and that was pretty much it. Now everyone is spinning up a bunch of additional services to just continually support research. And all of these things have actually really lend themselves to Kubernetes and sort of the cloud-native ecosystem as it provides a sort of platform-agnostic API that sort of gives us very good primitives in the scheduling of these different workloads. Now, why do we actually want to form a user group? Well, like it or not, we are a much smaller subset of the users when compared to something like enterprise, especially where they're primarily focused on services and they're not going to be spinning up, possibly thousands or hundreds of thousands of jobs. The enterprise type services also tend to they don't tend to be as resource intensive, and there's things like, we don't necessarily want bin packing, and beyond that, we require more advanced scheduling to support things like MPI. We want, fair share backfill, and a whole slew of the stuff that's come from sort of the classic HPC world. That's not to say this stuff doesn't have MPI support. We do see a little bit of that in Kubeflow with the MPI operator, KubeBatch in the upstream project, and Volcano, a sort of a more cloud-native batch scheduler, and all of which are actually powered by the upstream KubeBatch. And while all these things haven't necessarily been forgotten by upstream, they have very largely been underrepresented. So the mission of the CNCF research group. I've been involved with like Kubernetes, the CNCF, and spoken with like many research groups over the past couple of years. Many of them are sort of grappling with the same sort of problems and developing sort of solutions and workarounds in silos and aren't necessarily like sharing this information with each other that well. And there also hasn't been like a strong unifying voice or group to help drive the research computing needs in the cloud native ecosystem and the upstream Kubernetes project. There's been sort of some little spin-offs and things like the big data user group, the machine learning working group, but for the most part, they haven't driven a lot of upstream development. So at KubeCon EU earlier this year in Barcelona, a bunch of us actually got together and sort of like decided, hey, we needed something like this. We need a place for researchers to sort of coordinate their actions and bring that stuff upstream. We weren't quite sure at the time if it was going to be a Kubernetes working group, CNCF, or working group, Kubernetes user group, or CNCF thing, and it turns out that the CNCF research user group was the one that won. So we haven't been working on this stuff for too long, but we've already sort of identified a few common themes. We sort of polled everyone that originally got involved, and the first thing that really came out is like we don't really know who's all doing research on like Kubernetes and research using this stuff, and everyone sort of feels like they're alone in the dark, sort of helming their own thing. Seconding that is that there isn't really a good set of best practices for operating large clusters or clusters where you're churning through a bunch of jobs. The sort of defaults out of the box aren't the greatest for that sort of thing. The other thing is like Kubernetes itself lacks sort of the more advanced scheduling primitives that we would historically use, namely being MPI and co-scheduling. And while there have been, the other big thing is again, mostly coming from classic sites, things like multi-cluster and multi-user, multi-tenancy are very important to us. And there hasn't been a focused effort on getting a lot of that stuff going upstream. So with these common themes, we actually started just a couple small little initiatives. Again, this is fairly new, so we haven't been able to do too much. But we created a research institute survey, so just sort of asking who's doing what. If you're interested in sharing, if you're running Kubernetes at a site and you want to talk a little bit about how you're doing it, this helps other research institutions sort of discover what they're doing, and they might ping you for a few questions if they're trying to do something similar. But we really want to know how are you deploying it, how are they managing it, how are they handling user management and things like that. And then a similar effort was actually done, I believe, in the OpenStack community, talking about that stuff earlier with Steve. And then eventually, we might get something more concise put together regarding that stuff. We also have it's like an awesome list of sort of helpful resources. So some best practices regarding how do you run big clusters, some of the tools out there like Volcano, Armada, a multi-cluster scheduler, and there are a few other little random things that are sort of helpful to us in getting started. We've also been meeting with some of the groups in the upstream community, like the Multitenancy working group. They're working on a hierarchical namespace controller to sort of subdivide out a namespace into smaller groups and apply policies down. We are also going to be meeting with the multi-cluster SIG to help drive some of more of that stuff upstream. And with that out of the way, now let's actually sort of dive in and have this discussion. Okay. It should be showing the results. Oh, there we go. Okay. Oh, just as a note, with us being researchers and data science-y type people, the results of this will all be PR'd later into the CNCF research user group repo. So it'll be available for anyone to play with and take a look at. If people want, I think it will save the names of people, but I can sanitize that stuff out. So looking at this, a lot of us are actually academics. Say not too much of a surprise there from what I've seen, but it's definitely good to know. Okay. Yeah, give me 1 sec. I have a little control panel, and it's being really slow for me to try and activate the results. Sorry about that. Okay. So this actually surprised me a good amount. There hasn't been a whole lot of groups that I've dealt with that are actually running it in production.
Define production for research.
Okay, sorry. That's a very good thing. I would say supporting research users, and are they actually using it to a capacity that besides a little POC, that might not be a good definition for production, but that might sort of satisfy that for now. Good enough. So out of curiosity, if people don't mind sharing, who's actually running it in production? Oh, well, I know you're running it in production. What sort of research workloads are you running on there? Do you have the microphone?
Do you want to start?
Sure, I'll start. Hi, Adam Tillman from University of California, San Diego. Right here. And so we have about 100 graduate students.
Can you?
Sorry.
That's all good.
Yeah, okay. So I have about 100 graduate students that are running various either batch or Jupyter interactive workloads on data science, machine learning. So we've got a GPU, CPU cluster on campus. We have a similar platform. Some of you may have run into Pacific Research Platform, or and so we work very closely with those folks on campus, and so they have a much broader kind of footprint in the kind of production research side of things.
Okay. Cool.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah. Yeah, Larry Smart. Work very closely with him. And Tom DeFonte, John Graham. Yeah, so.
Should we?
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm Ricardo from CERN. We've been using Kubernetes in production for a while now, and we do internal services, but on more research-oriented. We do offer what we call Spark as a service, where people can just click a button and get a Spark cluster that is backed by a Kubernetes cluster, and they submit their Spark jobs there. We have some Jupyter deployments that are backed also by Kubernetes clusters, and this is both for running the notebooks, hosting notebooks, and also offloading larger computations to also Kubernetes clusters. And we've been migrating part of our HT Condor batch farm to host it on Kubernetes. So basically deploy Condor on Kubernetes. So I think these are the most fitting use cases we have for this community.
Can you tell us something about the scale of deployment that you have at the moment?
Yeah, so we offer Kubernetes as a service, so it's very easy to get your own cluster. So in the end, we get way too many. We have 500 clusters. But of those, there's clusters that are just for test purposes. There's also clusters that are for services that are migrating to Kubernetes from traditional VMs and physical machines. And then we have some, 10% of those are production, I would say. And this can be anything from 5 or 10 node clusters to something like a couple of hundred. The largest clusters we had were 1,000 nodes. This was as big as we got. Yeah.
Did you want to say anything about the size of your?
Sure. Yeah, so we have a 25 node cluster and about 100 GPUs, so much smaller scale. Yeah.
isn't yours actually like stretched? Because like you have lots of like one node services joined with like one set of Kubernetes control plane nodes? Or do you have like multiple clusters?
So we've got the cluster that I personally manage is kind of monolithic and kind of located at a single site. Pacific Research Platform has nodes scattered all over the west coast of the U.S. And then I think they're actually running multiple control planes and then shifting nodes between those as the load warrants.
Fantastic.
Hi. Oh, that's loud. I've got a cold as well. I've got a very deep voice. Jamie from G Research. We do financial research over in London. We've got quite a lot of Kubernetes in production, mostly for services at the moment. So something in the order of 100, 150 nodes, multiple clusters. But our big interest is working out how to migrate our large Condor infrastructure, so similar to what Ricardo's got in a way. I guess in the order of thousands, tens of thousands of cores, trying to work out how to migrate these workloads over to Kubernetes.
Out of curiosity, is anyone else doing stuff with HD Condor?
I don't know if you get recorded unless you're talking to us.
We ran it in Kubernetes for about a year before that project got canceled, but we have done it successfully.
So are you still running Kubernetes then?
Yeah, we have about a dozen clusters now.
Okay.
Who's next? Okay.
Hey, I'm Jeremy Rogers. I work at the Oak Ridge National Laboratory, so no one's ever heard of us except for people in research. But as of yesterday, we still run the fastest supercomputer in the world, so that's great. I'm in the group that runs Summit, but my team specifically runs services around Summit. So we used to be core infrastructure, and what we had is like lots of scientists like to use lots of different tools. I'm an operations guy. I'm not a researcher, by the way. But they come to us and they're like, hey, we need to run this MariaDB, we need to run this whatever. So we moved to Kubernetes about a year and a half ago in production. We rolled it out. We've been running it for about 2.5 years now. And it's really nice. We provide Kubernetes as a service and also assistance with getting things into Kubernetes to run all of the ancillary stuff. And our big project right now we're working on is trying to get Jupyter Hub as a service, right? So ideally, there's like a front end, and the scientists, researchers can just like click a button. They get a Jupyter Hub that uses their allocation on all of our really big clusters. So that's where we're using it in production.
So would someone mind closing the door? We're getting a fair amount of noise.
So roughly how many clusters or size?
We have 3 clusters. Each one has about 40 nodes on it. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And anyone else doing that hub?
Yeah, who is interested in doing something like you've heard the production people talk about running? Like Jupyter Hub, HD Condor, some of the other bigger clusters? Okay. Interest? Okay.
Who's next? Anyone else? It's going to go somewhere.
Okay. Let's kick it over to the next one then. That's kind of word spaghetti. We see a lot of Kubeflow, Helm, GitLab, OpenShift.
Data's bigger.
Huh?
Data, Jupyter?
Yeah. Data and Jupyter. Oh, yeah, that's getting bigger. So the interest in Jupyter is probably the one that I've seen the most. That's the one that everyone's been trying to spin up and run. And most of that is actually these days is trying to get to Kubeflow, since Kubeflow actually packages so much into it. Looks like we got a little bit of Spark, TensorFlow. This will probably be easier to take a look at once the data is sort of spread out in like a CSV or something. Yeah. So if you're typing like a phrase, it's not the best one, but it sort of is what it is.
Our group has had a lot of conversation, and you guys just behind me mentioned that like Slurm and other queuing things and how that relates. That hasn't shown up on this so much yet.
Yeah.
Actually, the Slurm is actually one of our small use cases, because like the main batch farm is actually what we call high throughput computing, not necessarily HPC. But we do have one large HPC cluster where we run Slurm. And what we are looking actually is what was being described before, which is to simplify the life of people submitting jobs to Slurm, but also analyzing the output data. We are looking into offering one profile in the Jupyter Hub where they will get a notebook that gives them access to the Slurm cluster, and also allows them to use notebooks to analyze the output, which is like something that is not trivial to do with Slurm. You would have to copy the data somewhere else and do your analysis. So having this in a Jupyter notebook, actually, I think it's a pretty good thing.
Okay. I'll kick it over to the next one.
No responses yet.
Scaling. Multi-tenancy has definitely been a big one that we've seen, especially for those of us coming from the classic HPC side, where we are used to sharing a large sort of shared POSIX environment. And there definitely hasn't been a good sort of translation over to how you go from like a POSIX identity to more of like an API identity, where you're running things with services. There's definitely been a lot of efforts to sort of like bridge that gap a little bit, especially in the multi-tenancy working group, pointing out him over there as a member of the multi-tenancy working group.
I'm interested in the person that's mentioned security. Can I ask who that was? Yeah? Okay, well, fair enough. I understand now.
Financial industry.
Yeah. Anyone else expecting more sensitive payloads on, yeah? Yeah?
He's my boss. We run a restricted data environment.
Yes, I know that, yes. We're very versatile. I'll let you...
We're a university that has a health system attached to it, and so we get massive amounts of health system data as well as insurance claims data that I think people really want to manipulate, and their data set sizes are now reaching, like they'll get Medicare data set size, almost a terabyte in size, which SAS doesn't deal well with.
So I'm in the exact same boat.
Do you maintain separate environments, or do you just put it all in one and just treat them all as like, you know, S4 type of data?
So we actually have separate environments for restricted data compared. So we have an HPC restricted data environment and an HPC not restricted data environment, and then we have a private cloud for does the same thing basically. Our university mandates that our restricted data stays separate. So it's an ease of use so that you know that's secure because it's over there. So.
Can you go more into like how you guys organize that, like for so you get an on-prem and then like a cloud solution?
So both actually, whatever we build on-prem, we mirror basically, and whatever we build in the cloud, we're mirroring. So we are building a public cloud restricted data environment. Then we're starting with AWS, and then we'll slowly branch out other things as people ask for it, and as we don't want to do everything all at once because we don't have the people to do that. And so start one place. Even though the researchers were clamoring for Google, for some reason leadership said, let's do AWS. And so, start somewhere, I guess.
Yep. one of the things I'm seeing also multiple times throughout this is with the comments, like, it's easy in the learning curve. That is definitely something that we have seen repeatedly over and over again. The internal training is definitely a problem. We have sort of solved this a little bit, like we have a set of tutorials that we have for getting people sort of up to speed on Kubernetes. And part of that tutorial, if it's a research user, we get Jupyter Hub up and going and show them how to like use Jupyter Lab and that sort of thing. You had a question?
Documentation for Kubernetes is really focused kind of around the operators using it. And there's not a clean separation of like, I am providing a cluster for you, here's the documentation on how you would use it as a user.
Who else has had this sort of problem?
Everyone?
Decent chunk. No. That is something that is I wouldn't call it like low-hanging fruit. Oh, low-hanging fruit is the wrong word. That is something that we should be able to solve fairly quickly. A lot of us now have experience with running these sort of things. So one thing that was identified is building that common best practices and building out some documentation. I think at this point is just finding a few people that might be able to sort of get going with this effort and start putting words down. And some of it we actually have more like internally too. It's just not publicly available. Let's see.
I think this relates to your very opening question asking, saying everyone in this room are researchers, but if I asked you how many of you are actual academics, there wouldn't be probably that many, I imagine, right? But we're all custodians of research infrastructure, that's the way I tend to call it, and then the question is how do we empower ourselves to make the best experience for our research users? So if we call you researchers, you know what we mean.
Cool. I'll kick over to the next one. Probably the most important one. So where should we as a group, we've talked a little bit about some of the problems we've encountered, some of the tools we're looking at. Where should we as a group focus our efforts? What do you think we should prioritize? It's sort of like Reddit, so you can upvote and downvote options. Multi-tenancy is definitely looking like the big one so far. It's less, I would say, duplicating, and more so, if you are interested in this, like start talking to the multi-tenancy working group in the upstream project, yeah. Or maybe Ryan wouldn't mind coming back again to discuss that stuff with the project more. The other thing is just getting end user feedback for some of this stuff. A lot of times, something gets sort of deployed and there isn't a good response, there's no feedback. And driving this stuff really, really requires that. This has been actually a fairly large problem in the multi-cluster SIG. They've been trying to get more end user feedback regarding some of the stuff that they're doing, and for the most part, it's been pretty quiet. They want to accommodate this stuff. They just haven't gotten good feedback regarding how they should design it, and the sort of different needs that we have.
And I think part of that is rather than there's 21 responses, rather than all of us try and speak to each of these group ourselves, yep. As one coordinated effort, we're going to have far more impact, and we can work towards some best practice.
Yeah. If we can say 24 research sites are interested in pushing forward with this feature, and especially if they're willing to test it and provide feedback, we will get a much better thing out of the entire effort. Documentation is the next one. Yeah. That one is something, honestly, it's probably going to fall into us as users to solve. because there really just isn't a lot for people out there that are trying to run research workloads on Kubernetes. And the documentation itself is very much geared towards the more enterprisey type workloads.
One other comment about documentation is there's almost too much of it, right? I almost never start with one browser tab on documentation, and I almost never end up with one tab because I always end up opening like 5
It's like the
other
Wikipedia game where you're
yeah,
just going.
I'll get to this later, and I never do. So.
Yeah. So building more concise documentation or having a single place for it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Concise documentation.
Okay. Yeah. That, I think, is something we can definitely work on, especially if we have the CNCF Research User Group Git repo. If we want to create a folder in there and start like dumping, some best practice, some of the documentation for stuff, that'd be great. And it's essentially accessible to everyone. And if something gets out of date, it's just a PR away from getting fixed. One last thing I want to touch on is just the batch. By batch, there's a couple different efforts going on right now in this. For those that don't, there's like KubeBatch, which is sort of an upstream project to sort of provide the base batch capabilities. But now we've sort of seen a lot of this being developed outside of the Kubernetes project itself. There is a project called Volcano, which actually is developed by one of the leads of SIG scheduling, who is an ex-IBMer. And they're adding things like queues, fair share, backfill, the stuff that's pretty stereotypical of the things that we work with. And then recently, I haven't had a chance to play with it. It was announced at SC, but Google just released their sort of K-batch or batch on GKE. Yeah. That one, it's still in, I believe, in beta, and it's like they only support deploying workloads to single node right now. But that is something we could also engage more with. It's complicated. No, but possibly in the future. Right now, it's not. As far as I know, there's more development going on internally. But again, I don't know where it will be in the future. Yep. My guess would be things like going to Lustre, or the GPFS. There we go. Thank you. The more classic shared. Yeah.
Sorry, I guess the question was more to engage with the CSI drivers that will expose those file systems, or what? We use CEFFS and 2 other internal storage, and we rely on CSI for all of them. Is this something we would follow?
So I'm from NERSC, which is another DOE supercomputing lab, and our challenge really is identity mapping to pods.
Yep.
And so it's syncing up the inside world and the outside world around UIDs, and that's very difficult to do without kernel or. We need help. It's not something that we likely can solve on our own.
Yeah, I'd actually, it's still in POC form. It's a project that I developed over a year ago that would do an LDAP lookup and pull the POSIX identity from that and basically mutate the pod to run the pod as that UID and GID. But that does have some other problems with adding that identity to the container itself.
Yeah, similar. We have existing Lusters and NFS shares and things that users would like to go into Jupyter Hub, log in through Jupyter Hub, get a Jupyter, then access their data from the cluster in Jupyter. So we're currently looking at OPA policies to allow them to only use their own UID, and then let them use their mounts directly then. Okay.
We're actually, I think we're now out of time.
Can we?
But yeah, was there?
And I want to just get Cheryl.
Huh? Okay.
Them said. That's exactly how we do it right now. So on all of our Kubernetes hosts, we mount GPFS, we mount NFS, and we mount Lustre. And we, on every namespace, we have an annotation that we set that's their specific ID of their project. and then we use OPA to enforce that their pods run as that user ID and group ID, and then host mount it up into the container. It's not perfect, but I mean that's
the best workaround that we have, right now.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
So.
Just one comment on that. We're trying to minimize the amount of programming and refactoring that our scientists have to do, and they're inheriting a bunch of containers that expect to run as root, right?
Yeah.
And so, we can be the department of no, but, telling them, no, go ahead, and here's how you go ahead and you make your pod so it can run as you, it's not a pleasant answer to deliver over and over.
I had a workaround for that one, but essentially it would an init container that would add the identity to it, and you still had some file permissions issues depending on how it was deployed, but for the most part it worked. But we're I think now past our time, so I just want to toss this out. If this is stuff you are interested in, please join the mailing list. Please join in on some of the calls that we have. Our times right now are not West Coast friendly. It's because most of our users have been either in the EU or APAC, but we can revisit that again. Yeah.
Have you guys considered starting a Google group in any way?
We don't have a Google group. We have just the mailing list on the Linux the one that the CNCF uses. I forget what's.
There's a chance for us to catch up tonight, not only at the block party, but I'll introduce Cheryl and.
Do you mind if I come up and do one slide just to show people? Do you mind plugging that in?
Oh yeah, sure.
Thanks.
Where's your HDMI?
Hey, so I'm Cheryl. I'm the Director of Ecosystem at the CNCF, and I run some of the end user groups from the CNCF perspective.
Don't have any adapter for it.
There's no dongles?
Nope.
Okay. Anyone have a USB-C dongle?
Here, I can. Is this shared with me? Or here? Yeah, we have people waiting over there, so. Okay.
Okay, you can do this.
Okay.
So I run the user groups from the CNCF perspective. Okay. So we're super keen to get as many people as possible to not necessarily contribute code back, but at least be active and engaged and make their thoughts known within the CNCF. So tonight we're going to have a 8 till 10 p.m. Social kind of happy hour, so after the all attendee party. And it's not specific for, back up one, up one, there we go. It's not specific for research, but it's for end users generally. So it's 6 minutes walk from the conference center. Please come along and just go and meet other people there. Cool. Thanks.
Cool. No, we should do that outside though, because there's a line of people out there. The last little thing, if you go to this the presentation from earlier, the PDF for the research user group, there's a bunch of links to the other sessions that are relevant as a sort of single source of truth for them.